Hello, Brentwood Hills family. With the way our church services are these days, and many of us are having worship along with Brentwood Hills online at home, maybe you want to make your own communion bread to have at home. So I just wanted to see if I could help a little bit. This is a little tutorial, and I'm going to be using pretty much the same recipe that all the women who make communion bread for Brentwood Hills use, except I'm going to be scaling it down a little bit in smaller portions. On page 273 of the 50th anniversary cookbook is a recipe for communion bread that is 1/4 of what we use every week at Brentwood Hills. So we're going to be making a smaller amount today. I'm so happy to have Sarah Ann here. She is my camera person. So I've already got all my ingredients, and I cleaned off my countertop really well because that's where I'm going to be rolling it out. And I've already kind of measured everything out. Here I have 1 cup of plain or all-purpose flour, and if you see a little bit over here, when I leveled off my cup, I put it over here because I'm going to need some for when I roll it out. So I've got 1 cup of all-purpose flour, and I like using a brand name instead of a generic because it just kind of seems to turn out better. And so I also have the recipe calls for the big recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of salt. 1/3 of that is approximately 3/4 of a teaspoon. So there's 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. And then I like using the Crisco sticks, and I cut off the measurement for 1/3 of a cup of Crisco. So I'm going to put that in here. And as I said, I washed my hands really good before I started and washed my countertop. So tell you what, I like to use a pastry blender, and that does it really well, but you might not have one of these. So if you don't, take 2 knives, and the way that the instructions say is to cut your shortening into your flour. And I'm not going to do this for long because it is kind of an irritating sound. You can do it really with your hands washed really well. You can actually just kind of work it in like this. It's a matter of getting your flour and your shortening really worked in together. But I am going to use my pastry blender because that's what I'm used to. Just want you to know it is possible to do it using 2 knives. But I'm going to put these aside, and use my pastry blender. So this is the way this works. Y'all, the recipe for communion bread is essentially pie crust. And my grandmother taught me how to do this when I was about 12 years old, and I've been happy to be able to help with making it for Brentwood Hills. And I know we're also appreciative of all the ladies who make our homemade communion bread at Brentwood Hills. So this is called cutting the flour into the shortening, and I'm just gonna keep on doing it until it's sort of the consistency of coarse meal. Don't want any big globs, because those globs are what make holes in the pastry, and we really don't want any holes in it. So I'm just going to do this for another few seconds. I do love my pastry blender. Gonna get this extra shortening off of here. As I told you, I'll clean my hands really well. Okay, this is about as good as it gets. Okay, you can see the consistency of that. It's all nice and worked in, no big globs. All right, now the recipe calls for cutting it down into 1/3. We would be using 1/3 of a cup of ice water. This is not exactly precisely 1/3 of a cup because I kind of know how much I want to use, and but you can certainly measure it. What I do is I make a well in the middle of my dough here, and I'm going to pour the water in the middle. And what you do is, you can do this with a fork or a spoon, but you stir in the middle and then you just start letting that dough kind of stick to it. And the key to good pastry is don't overwork it. And once it kind of starts sticking, you want to just let it kind of grab there. And I'm going to now, got to start using my hands. Just kind of roll it around and let it grab the rest of that dry, and just roll it around and see how it makes a nice little ball there. Okay, now if you ever want to make a pie, this is just about enough for a pie crust. You can cut the measurements down more, or if you want to make communion bread ahead of time for the next few Sundays that we're going to be having our worship services online, this freezes great. Okay, so there it is in a nice ball. So now, we're going to pause for a minute while I clean off my hands. Okay, here we are right back again. We're exactly where we were before, just now my hands are a little bit cleaner. I don't have dough all over. Okay, I'm going to take some of my flour and just sprinkle it on my countertop. Really plenty. Just want to, it's going to spread out pretty well. Okay, I put my ball of dough. You never ever need, you never ever work it up more than you absolutely have to. And I'm also going to put some flour on my rolling pin. Okay, I'm going to start rolling this out. So it's kind of sticky, and that's okay. Just want to handle it gently. Turn it over. Be sure your surface is floured really well. Some people use a pastry cloth or a different board to roll it out on. That's great. Whatever you're used to. Also, pastry is not extremely smooth. If you can see these little things that look like globs in it, those are the pieces of shortening. That's what makes it flaky. Okay, we want to roll this out to a thickness of about, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch. I want to make sure that when we start cutting it, that it's not going to stick. It's okay if it pulls apart a little bit, not a problem. Okay, so I'm going to get it rolled out nice and thin. If you want perfection, watch a professional cooking show on here. You get what you pay for, which is nothing. This is free. All right, now you're thinking, okay, how do we get the shape? Well, you might have a biscuit cutter at home. Some people use a can that has both ends cut out of it because you got to have the air. I happen to have this scalloped cutter. I've used it many times. Some of the ladies who make our communion bread have a square scalloped cutter. I think I have one of those somewhere. Whatever you use, you want the edges of it to be coated in, I'm gonna get this out of my way. You want it to be coated in flour so that it won't stick. So, sometimes I make shapes like this. I'll be sure we have a good cut, and like this. And this is what I would use if we were going to be having it at Brentwood Hills. So I'm going to lift this up very, very carefully and put it on my pan over here. And there is plenty of flour on the back. It's not too sticky. But you just don't want it to, sometimes I get a little flour on it. You don't want it to stick to your pan. Okay, I'm going to do these 3, and then I'm going to do a couple other ways of cutting it. Ooh, this one's a little stretchy, a little sticky. Okay. Another thing is, if you want to make some smaller pieces, you can certainly do some smaller ones. I've got this biscuit cutter make some nice, cute little smaller ones. And I'll put those on my pan. Don't want to get in the way of my camera woman. Okay. Again, I'm not going for perfection here. I know you're all very forgiving. Okay, here's another thing that I sometimes use when I'm doing it at Brentwood Hills. It's a little pastry cutter, and sometimes I just try to do a really straight line and just do some squares with this. You know, just whatever you might have. I'm going to take away the extra. These pieces can be re-rolled. Sometimes you might need a little bit of water, just a teeny bit of water to get them to stick together for the re-roll. So I'm going to do some more of these because while we're having our communion time at home, I'm going to be using these smaller ones. I'm also just going to cut some smaller pieces with this. Again, when you're doing it at home, you do it however you want because it's for your family. And you know, we don't want the shapes to be too distracting, to want to keep our minds on what the purpose of this is, but we also want them to be functional and useful. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to re-roll up the pieces. I'm handling these very delicately. They're a little bit sticky. When you need to use the scraps, have as little flour on them as possible, and don't I'm going to reuse these. Okay, now, okay, here's what I do. I just take all the pieces and I just squeeze. I'm not going to knead it. I'm just trying to get them to stick together. Just barely squeeze. So I'm going to get my flour back over here. Get a little bit more. And you notice I didn't knead it. I just got it stuck together. Now I'm pressing down real good. And that's how you reuse the pieces. Again, want to be sure your surface is good and floured. See, and here again we can just cut out more pieces. Okay, we pretty much have a pan full here, and you can decide what is a pan full for you. I'm going to go ahead, even though I've still got some more dough here, I'll do that on the next pan. I'm going to go ahead and show you another really, really important step, and that is poking holes in the pastry. So you want to use a fork, dip it in flour so it doesn't stick, and you want to make, this is what I do, I just make rows and rows of holes, because if you didn't poke the holes, the pastry would get holes. It would puff up and have bubbles all in it, and we don't want that. This is definitely unleavened bread, but it just can't help it. When it gets hot, it'll make bubbles. Okay, we've got holes all in it, and now I'm going to put it in the oven. In this recipe, it says 20 minutes at 375, but in my oven, that's always been too high and too long. I'm going to put it in at 350 and check it at 10 minutes. We don't want it to get brown. We want it to be firm, not bendy at all, but you kind of just have to adjust it to your oven. So we're going to put it in. Also, I find that when the time is up, when I take it out of my oven, that if I just let it sit on the pan, it always gets a little bit more done in just those couple of minutes after I take it out of the oven. So I'm going to put it in my oven at 350 and set my timer for 10 minutes. Okay, as it turns out, it takes 15 minutes to get this the right amount of doneness. 15 minutes, 350 degrees. And the reason I didn't know that ahead of time is because I always do it just until I know it's done. And so I timed it for you all, and I hope you have a great time making communion bread. Sometimes if you put some little pieces of scraps on the pan, I don't have any on this one, but I have some on another pan that I have, you can kind of test it and then eat those. So anyway, y'all have a great time making your own communion bread, and I look forward to the time when we all get to be back together at the church building.